we want to turn again to the issue of Niger quickly, Rania, before we move forward in the show. I mean, in some ways, things are still in a holding pattern there if you really look at what's taking place. I mean, the issue of a potential ECOWAS invasion still on the table. They're meeting today, but there is growing pushback against that, certainly on the African continent in various institutions like the African Union, the civil society level, even in countries like Nigeria, where we've seen the Christian Association of Nigeria, a number of organizations that are in the northern part of the country come out against it. Obviously, countries themselves, Mali, Burkina Faso, Guinea, standing with Niger. So it doesn't really necessarily seem like those countries even are in a great position to launch a conflict. Algeria, of course, also against it, but it's still there because they have put themselves out there in a big way, saying that the coup, so-called coup, military transition must end in Niger. But there are a range of different things that we could see happen. I think it's very important people watch it very, very closely. There's a number of different things that could be said, Rania. I mean, I think the New York Times put out their big article yesterday, and you might be shocked, Rhonda, you might be shocked. It indulged in quite a few interesting distortions, if you might say, that were designed, Eugene, I think, to create the perception that what's happening is not what you see happening to my left right now, a social uprising that is taking on various different elements, but that, it's a huge blow to freedom and democracy and the West's efforts to bring freedom and democracy to Niger and the broader African continent.
I gotta say, there's obviously other parts of this that I want to hear your take on, but the level of hand-wringing over the fact that there are people who do support this, and the way it's being framed as, another African country succumbs to authoritarianism because they don't like who the US likes. That's essentially what the New York Times and a lot of these other liberal outlets are saying, is that if Africans are not happy with client or puppet or ally of the US in power, then it's because they're anti-democratic and inherently opposed to freedom. And there's such a racist element to that. That's what they're saying. That is what they are saying. That this is, and to even suggest that and you made this point so many times before, the idea that because somebody was voted for by people in a city at one point, that's the limits of democracy. That's literally the limits of democracy when it comes to global South countries, is if we set up this NGO-based voting apparatus that doesn't address any other civic needs besides voting, and then people turn against it, it's authoritarianism. But specifically, if it's somebody we liked. And now there's somebody in power who's saying mean things about France and mean things about imperialism, therefore anti-democratic and authoritarian. But one thing I want to ask you about, Eugene, is I think there's something quite significant about the fact that the African Union had this meeting, and you have countries explicitly saying that they oppose a military intervention. Very large, important countries across Africa who are no, we're not going to get on board with this ECOWAS notion of military intervention. Can you explain what happened and the significance of really large countries like Ethiopia, obviously South Africa, and others essentially not refusing to get on board with this? What does it mean about what's happening on the African continent?
Well, I think it means a few things. I mean, some of the countries you just mentioned, South Africa especially, has a long record, actually, of being against U.S. and other types of interventions on the continent. And the SADC bloc of Southern African countries is sort of known for that, although they now started to back away a little bit from that in Mozambique. Ethiopia, a little bit less so, but similarly. But I think what we're seeing across Africa in relationship to what's happening in Niger is in the context of, the youngest continent, a population of countries that are tired of living in total poverty, marginalization, and dispossession, are looking for there to be significant changes. I think many African leaders are fully aware of the fact that most people don't think those changes are going to come on the back of Western bayonets, and certainly, their own popularity is to some degree at stake. I think that there are a whole range of other issues that are motivating it. I think many African countries, certainly Algeria has made this point, Mali has made this point, are very fearful of what the impact of this was. I mean, certainly the destabilization of Niger, even further than it already is, spilling over into Mali and Burkina Faso at a time where these, I don't know, for lack of a better word, jihadist insurgencies are thriving, could create all sorts of very complicated ISIS-style situations. It will supercharge the issue of immigration. It could potentially lead to significant collapse in other West African nations. You've already seen Benin, others, even in Mali, if you look at where the conflicts that they push further and further out of the sort of Saharan element to the lower parts of the country, central and southern parts of the country. So already you're in a situation where there's a significant expansion of violence and unrest. And that this kind of conflict would actually make it worse, because then you would have the governments of Niger and potentially Mali and Burkina and maybe even Guinea, who have said they were going to stand with Niger, fighting other African countries. And then the people who they're mainly fighting now would obviously take advantage of that and try to establish their own sort of projects. Who knows? Basically, who knows what the spillover effect is going to be? But you can say for sure, immigration, poverty, which is already very bad, income inequality, which is already very bad, the deaths and instability, which is already very bad, would only get worse and worse and worse, and would in fact expand across the West African space into parts of Central Africa, I think reverberate in different ways in other countries in Northern Africa, Libya, Algeria, and others. So, I think many countries are seeing that right now, the possibility of, this spiraling out of control in a way that's hard to even imagine is very high. The balkanization of Africa and it turning into like a warren of insane killing is there. So it's an interesting thing, because I think the ECOWAS countries that are opposed to Niger are taking, have a different set of concerns. And that set of concerns is they're afraid they could be next. They themselves have said that they're concerned that after Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, that it could spread to other countries. And I think that's important to note, because, why is this happening? And I think that's something that is being, and this leads to my point about the New York Times, this is something that's being totally washed out. It's just like there's just some random coup by these random military people. But as I pointed out in our discussion last week, as the former finance minister of the now deposed government of Niger said last year in 2022, he said, we're sitting on a social time bomb. Because the country is totally destitute at the bottom of almost all development indicators. You've got 42% of people living on $1.90 or less every single day. You've got 42-ish, 43-ish% of children 5 to 14 are involved in child labor. They're what's known as working children. So, that's basically nearly half of the children in the country over the age of 5 and under 15 are actually working. You've got the unbelievable destruction and poisoning of the earth and the air and the water by the uranium trade, where these French companies could care less about what they are doing. Only 37% of people are literate in the country. There's about 4.5 million, and this number is growing because of the sanctions against Niger, about 4.5 million people, 4.4 million, who cannot survive every day unless they have access to humanitarian aid. They just cannot survive. They would, undoubtedly perish, and are now going to be in a situation that could be akin to famine because of the sanctions that are being leveled on Niger. And then you have the extreme instability of happening in the country. You've got these insurgencies. You've got the fact that since the state is so weak and the social and economic investment is so low, in addition to these, I almost hate to call them jihadists in a way, because they're misusing Islam for their own banner. But beyond that, you have a huge array of just bandits, right? Like anybody who can get enough money to get some motorcycles and some weapons, of which there are many because of the destabilization of Libya in 2011 by NATO in and of itself, that you have all these problems that are existing. And this is a country where almost 50% of the country is under the age of 15. So it's a very young country where people like all over the African continent are just fed up and they cannot take it anymore, and they want to see a big change. And that's how you can have elements of the military, elements of the political elite, and so on and so forth, then, take their opportunity. I think you look at some of the people like the leader of Burkina Faso, they're obviously motivated to some degree, I think, by, and perhaps more than some degree, by social concerns of wanting to change these conditions. We don't know if that's true of all these people. I think there's a lot of opportunists and others who are just looking to improve their own position. But the only reason why they can take this sort of action is they know it will be supported by the masses of people who are like, yes, we will try anything. When almost the whole country's living in in poverty, people will take almost any opportunity. And that's the final two things I just want to say here before we move to our next guest. First and foremost, this issue of the election and the overthrow of democracy. It's interesting to me that Macky Sall, the current president of Senegal, is one of the biggest supporters of an ECOWAS invasion of Niger. It's a very similar situation to what's happening in the Senegalese elections right now, where he is orchestrating an effort that has banned the number one opposition figure, the most popular person who is the most likely to challenge the Senegalese regime and has also been critical of France. Well, this, much ballyhooed election where Bazoum was elected, and by the way, Bazoum, has backed coups in the past in Niger, but, this much ballyhooed election, same situation. The number one opposition person was banned from participating in the election, on the basis of lawfare, essentially very similar to Senegal. And many people felt at the time that, essentially the fix was in because the only person who could have potentially won outside of Bazoum was out of the race. So I don't know how democratic that really is. Large numbers of people couldn't participate because there was obviously a massive terrorist insurgency. People are attacked for going to vote. So the idea that there is some great democratic mandate or something like that, or that Bazoum is some great Democrat, is I think in and of itself problematic. But then the second piece of it is, there's this whole conversation, and the New York Times made a big point about this. Well, violence is down in Niger, and it's because America and France have trained all these excellent troops who are, here. And unlike Mali and Burkina Faso, who have gotten rid of France and are, shock of all shocks, working with Russia, their violence is going up there. And, there's a truth to it, but that's why I thank you so much, Matt, there behind the scenes, very Johnny on the spot, bringing up that graph. So the blue on the left there, or my left, is Niger. Then there's Mali in between, and then on the right is Burkina Faso. Now, as you can see, for pretty much the entirety of this discussion, which goes back, or this graph, a little bit before 2019, Mali and Burkina Faso have had more violence than Niger. So already it was not, it wasn't like they were higher or something than Mali and Burkina Faso and now have gone lower. But it's also worth noting, if you look at the bar graph, that represents the number of incidents. And you look towards the end of the blue and you see a little spike, which comes right over 2023, which is, of course, in 2022, like right now, basically, the time where allegedly, there was all this great training from America and from France that was, taking on these terrorists and taking them down. But the number of incidents was actually going up and spiking at the time. But what did happen is, and thankfully for this, let's point that out, the number of people dying has gone down. And it's harder to see on that graph, but there's a black line, and the black line is also the number of people dying. But you'll also see there's a precipitous drop in the number of people dying in Burkina Faso around the same time you see it in Niger. But the overall number is a lot higher, so you don't necessarily see that, but it's a part of the trend. And you can also see the trends are relatively similar too and how they go up and down. So I just say all that to say, France and the United States have been there since like 2014, building these drone bases. They've had thousands of troops. At one point, France had 5,000 troops there. They've been training people for over 10 years. And so this idea that somehow magically, all of a sudden, it was France and the United States and the troops with their great training that are turning it around, I think is a huge oversimplification of what's actually happening here. And I think it's designed to create a totally fake narrative that America and Europe are for fighting terrorism and helping democracy. Russia is against it. And so insofar as you see countries breaking with France and talking more with Russia, they're evil authoritarians just like Putin and just like the Russians, and they're being either duped or they themselves are deeply malign, forces, when in fact, these governments that were supported by the US and France for years were not democratic, were constantly manipulating elections. Many of them have been involved in coups themselves at different points over the different years. They have huge numbers of human rights abuses associated with them. They were totally unable to turn around the situation in terms of these insurgencies. And this fake history is now being created on the basis of 6 months in the first part of this year, and a conflict that's been going on for 15 years to try to create a false impression of what's happening and to make it seem This is the most important thing, to not make it seem like what it really is, which is the combination of a social explosion and a mass uprising of poor working people and peasantry against neocolonialism and abject poverty in alliance with some subset of the military and the elites. They want you to think it's just a purely top-down process being governed by the Wagner Group or something, and that the worst thing that could ever happen for Africa is America and France be kicked out. So there's a lot more to it than that. You can obviously watch what we did there on Dispatches, but it really is, it's just unbelievable to see the level of distortion that's out there on some of these issues. Disgusting, actually.
Well, I feel like it calls for maybe a second episode or another episode to follow up on all this, hopefully very soon. But, for those who haven't seen it, me and Eugene did do an hour-long episode on this very issue last week. After you're done watching this live stream, you can go check it out in the Dispatches playlist of this channel. But no, I mean, it's a really important... It's something very important that's taking place, and I think it speaks to the social explosion you're talking about, as well as like some shifts we're seeing around the globe, but across Africa especially. And it's like kind of a long time coming. And I think I've seen this said in other places, is like nobody expected it to come from Niger, but it's like almost like, why wouldn't you? Given everything you just described, but no, there's so much more to be said, which is why I do think that we do need to like revisit this and have like a lengthier episode on it. But I think all that matters here is that to watch all of these media outlets like the New York Times throw a temper tantrum, essentially, because maybe they don't want the US there. Yeah. And oh no, France. It's like, okay.
Yeah, I mean, gosh.
Calm down, guys.
So much more that can be said. I read a report this morning, although I haven't confirmed it, that some of the troops from Niger, French troops, are going to Chad, also brought to power in a military coup. Cote d'Ivoire, by the way, its president, one of the number one people who wants to invade Niger, also brought to power in a military coup and illegally ran for a third term in the elections just a couple years ago. But democracy, freedom. Anyway.